What's up, y'all? TBrown31 here, JaboctheGreat, back with us. Welcome back to the last word, y'all. I would say at this point, some of the, tidal wave of emotions has sort of calmed down with these rankings and this playoff seed and everything, but it is still pretty heated all over the place, especially with Alabama missing the playoffs, the first 12-team playoff. A lot of, I guess, controversy with that one, but look, end of the day, man, we were talking about this just before. I still think that this is the best that's ever been. We've had a long road to get to a 12-team playoff, and even with all the criticism you may have about the seeding, what games are played here, there, I still think it's the best thing that we've gotten so far. So, both of us are excited to start it off, and honestly, like let's be real here. I don't think there's really too much to criticize with these, the seeds and everything for the most part. It might be a little bit in the middle there, but I think for the most part, man, they got it right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have many complaints about this. As a Clemson fan, I mean, I'm happy that we forged our way in at the very end. It might just lead to one more week of pain and suffering, but as a whole, I think it's good. I think it's a really cool top four: Oregon, Georgia, Boise State, Arizona State. It makes sense with the conference champion things, right? Clemson, obviously ACC champion, not going to be top four because they're ranked 16 overall. But I think it's cool. I think seeing Oregon, obviously they're undefeated. There's no shot that they don't get number one. Georgia had a lot of adversity. They fight their way through, win the SEC title. Easy pick for number two. And then Boise State. I mean, you can make a case that they could have been two because they've got less losses in Georgia. Their only loss is to Oregon, but I think considering the team and who Georgia is, there's no issue to put Boise State at three. And the same thing when you compare like Arizona State to Clemson with those two conference champions. I think Arizona State is kind of the clear bid there for just a little bit of a better season. They're the fourth highest ranked, so they get the fourth spot. But even outside of just like where they fell numerically, I think that one makes sense. And then from there, yeah, I mean, like, I don't know. I think they got it right. Obviously, Penn State is going to get in. Texas was pretty much guaranteed. Tennessee and Ohio State seem pretty safe. I don't know why. Like, I didn't really perceive these two teams as we were moving into getting the bracket, but Indiana and Notre Dame make a lot of sense. They should. I think they got their spot up there. So nothing wrong with those guys. SMU and Clemson coming through at the bottom. SMU lost to Clemson in the ACC title. People were wondering if they would get in. I think they should have. I think they were a good team, and they do. They get in, and they actually get in above Clemson because of Clemson's ranking being outside of the top 12. So funny enough, overall, I mean that loss. They become ACC champions. Maybe they get a chance at the top four, but not majorly impactful. They'll play Penn State and then have a shot at Boise State if they get through Penn State. But I think it's very fun. There's some interesting teams that get left out. You think about this is the first 12-team playoff, and there's no Alabama and there's no Miami, but I think both of those two teams kick themselves out to be entirely fair. Alabama has some big wins. Also has some big losses. I will not overlook that Oklahoma loss. I said it when it happened. I thought that was a nail in the coffin for Alabama, and I stand on that one. Um, Kind of the same thing, Miami messing it up, losing to Georgia Tech, and then losing to Syracuse right at the end, shooting themselves outside of at a chance for the ACC championship. Feels like, yeah, maybe Miami, could be a better team than SMU. Maybe they're a better team than Clemson. Maybe they're a better team than Indiana, but it doesn't really matter. You didn't get a shot at the championship. You lost to some rougher teams towards the end of the season. I think Alabama and Miami, as the first two teams out, makes sense. They are good teams. They shouldn't be super far down on the ranking, but I do think that they both removed themselves from this playoff. Some other ones we can talk about: Ole Miss and South Carolina. I think it would have been cool to have those guys in there. BYU as well, but also had some rough moments through parts of the season that I think really messed them up. Ole Miss probably dealt South Carolina its killing blow. South Carolina, you know, just wasn't able to get over them in that game, and then Ole Miss themselves losing to Florida the way they did probably shot themselves out of the playoffs here too. So
And
I think the
Kentucky,
committee got it right.
yeah, that was
Um,
probably worse.
yeah, that's true. Um, so I think everything's right here. I think these matchups will be fun. I don't want to steal all the steam in the conversation before we start to kind of go through the matchups, but overall, there's not really a pick in this bracket that I think went wrong. So I like the way the new system's working. I think we can maybe tweak it if there's some issues with the way the conference buys work. But as a whole, I think this is a cool way to get this going, and I think it should be a fun playoff bracket.
Yeah, at the end of the day, man, look, one team with 3 losses got in, and that was Clemson, and obviously they only got in because they won the ACC title. Had they lost, they would have 4 losses. That would have been it,
Yeah.
of course. So I think that's when it comes down to it, I think that's what it is, and I think they do want to value those conference championship games, obviously, like because of the bids. Of course, the highest ranked 5 champions. 4 of them get the bye. They obviously want to put an emphasis on that game. And of course, you come into a game like a lot of these teams are evenly matched, theoretically, going into the game ranking wise, Oregon, Penn State are close, Georgia, Texas are close, even though they played early in the season. We saw how that went. SMU and Clemson, further apart, but at least relatively close still. Um, even like Arizona State, Iowa State, look close on paper, but obviously it wasn't. Um, but pretty much all of these games, like we look at them like, all right, they're on paper, they're close. So it's not like if one team loses, it's not really gonna be a big difference, right? Like I think they came into it saying, hey, if you made your conference championship, you're gonna get in regardless, unless you were that Clemson where you already had 3 losses. But again, that's kind of an outlier because Clemson, ironically, I mean, they had just one ACC loss this season, whereas Miami had 2. So, of course, that's why they jumped Miami, despite the worst overall record. Because, I mean, they had, 2 of their losses were against the SEC. So, I mean, maybe, maybe if Clemson had played more ACC games, it's just ironic. I don't think they would have done worse, but let's just say they did. Because ACC and SEC are the only conferences that don't play, 9 games, obviously, within their conference. Maybe if they played another one instead of playing, Georgia at the beginning of the season, and maybe they still lose that game, they don't lose as bad, but maybe it makes a difference in, who gets to the conference championship. We get Miami instead of Clemson. But Clemson did their job. They went in, they won that game. And it was convincing for most of it, much of that game until SMU came back, made it the game at the end. I think that's also why SMU was able to get in the playoffs with that last at-large spot. I think if SMU had continued to play like they did in the first, 5-6 minutes and they got blown out, probably a different conversation. Because I mean, pound for pound, I said this before. Alabama at their absolute best is probably, we're probably a better team than SMU. But your records have to matter. I mean, they have to matter at some point. And look, I like you said, I would have liked to see maybe an Ole Miss or South Carolina, but obviously South Carolina, they lost to the 2 teams right ahead of them, Alabama and Ole Miss, who also have 3 losses. So it is what it is. There, you got to win at least one of those games to get in. Ole Miss with the bad loss to Kentucky, lost to Florida, who at least looked better late in the season. And then Alabama, of course, themselves with losses to Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. And there's been so much conversation. Look, I remember last year with Florida State. I mean, we all remember how that went. And I thought it was bad last year. But my God, the Alabama fan, and it's mostly Alabama fans, pundits, that kind of whole thing. I see some like Ole Miss, maybe some South Carolina. I think we all kind of knew, like, unless there was a little bit more chaos at the end, like Ole Miss and Carolina weren't going to get in, even if they had looked maybe better than Bama late. But the sheer amount of just nonsense I see from Alabama fans, I mean, it's like, dog. I understand you beat Georgia. I understand on paper at your best you might be one of the best teams in the country, but like the results have to matter. And they're all talking about the out of conference schedule, and it's like that's part of why you didn't get in is because your out of conference schedule was nothing. And they're saying, hey, there's no incentive to schedule these hard out of conference games, if it doesn't matter. But this year you didn't. You didn't. Like you literally did not schedule a hard out of conference game, and it didn't help you. If you scheduled one out of conference game, like say how Georgia played Clemson, you don't have to beat an ACC, top 3 ACC team by 30 to look good. But if you play a top 25 team out of conference, I mean, maybe even top 10, like maybe they would have jumped SMU because at some point, I guess the big wins would have outweighed the bad losses. So at the end of the day, man, Alabama, it is what it is. Like, if we're going to be real here, if this was another team, it wouldn't be as much of a conversation because of what happened last year, because they got in. If a team late in the season lost 24-3 to Oklahoma, had 3 losses, we're not having this conversation. So I do think at the end of the day, I think they got it right. I was surprised that they did.
Yeah.
So I just don't think there shouldn't be as much discourse about it. It's just a little ridiculous, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I expect them to be better than Florida State was when they had their bowl game last year. But it feels like we're in the same
Yeah.
loop here, where it's like, oh well, we should have been in there, and like we could have won the national championship. And if Alabama for some reason goes and gets blown out by Michigan, then we'll have to have a really tough conversation, depending on how many of the players play in that game. But I think the committee got it right. I think that Alabama had a few missteps in the season. The Vanderbilt loss is a you fought for it. You were in there. The Tennessee loss, you fought for it. You were in there. Oklahoma came in and picked you apart. Ole Miss, as you said, I talked about the Florida game because I think about Jackson Dart's meltdown at the end of the game. But Kentucky was worse. That is true. Losing to Kentucky in general, I think, is a worse loss this season. So that one's going to come up big. And then for South Carolina, right? Like I would, it might sound crazy as a Clemson fan, but I would have loved to have South Carolina kind of sneak in and grab one of the spots. But Alabama doesn't get in. Ole Miss doesn't get in. Those are 2 of your 3 losses. Like it's a little tough to rationalize that. So I think overall, yeah, I think all these picks are correct. I think these are going to make a fun playoffs. I don't know. It'd be easy to, and we can do this here in a second. It'd be easy to say that maybe as fun as this will be, as big as the bracket is, it'll come down to some of the guys that are up there in the top 4 already. But that's kind of not the point. You give everybody a shot here to see where it goes. So I can talk about the matchups here. Take a brief second on each one of them. We're not going to break these down as in depth as we usually do. But coming up in a few weeks, we got Friday, December 20th. You'll have Indiana and Notre Dame. I think that one will be fun. Not to be easy, but I think I'd probably take Notre Dame in that one. And I really don't know how I feel when we move into Saturday's games. I'm going to say I would take Clemson over Texas. That's just me being a Clemson fan. Texas is probably going to beat us. If, for some reason, Kate Clemson can go into Austin and get a big win in his hometown, I'll be ecstatic. I think we have a better shot at beating Arizona State than Texas. So if we get through Texas, then I'll be somewhat happy about our chances until we probably match up with Oregon. And then I'll put the Clemson run to bed. But I'm going to take Clemson over Texas. I'd probably take Ohio State over Tennessee. I think that one might be a little tough for me, but I don't know. Tennessee's had some rough moments, and then to round out those top 4 matchups, this one might be crazy. And maybe it's maybe I need to look more at the first half, but I kind of feel like SMU could beat Penn State. Penn State played lights out in that Oregon game. I mean, they did really well, but I don't know, something about SMU. Maybe watching them, I gained a respect for them in the ACC championship. I'm going to take SMU over Penn State, and so for my round of 16 here, I'm going to take, or 12, sorry. I'm going to take Notre Dame, SMU, Clemson, and Ohio State.
Yeah, don't give me any ideas. They might decide to move it to 16. I mean, at some point, like I understand everybody's mad about, being left out right there at 12 through, 15, 16. Well, I guess not 16 with Clemson, but 12 through 15. It's like, look, at some point we can't just keep going. Like I think 12 is I thought 12 was too much initially anyway. I thought they were going to go to 8 before they moved to 12.
Yeah.
And I guess clearly, 8 wouldn't have been enough because it would have been conversations. Before I talk about the matches real quick, I do think we were talking about this before, and there's been a lot of conversation about this already. Some things that they might end up doing, as they move forward with this 12-team playoff system, they might change up, the bowl games. Like, are they going to do the bowl games and just the semifinals, just the quarterfinals? How are they going to do that? Because obviously they've been rotating them the past 10 years. Because why is it like, these first round games, why are they home games, but then the teams that get buys, have to go on the road, I guess, technically. So maybe they might try to figure something out with that. The paths, obviously, a lot of talk about Oregon having to play either Ohio State or Tennessee, and then possibly, whoever wins out of the Arizona State, Clemson, Texas little mini bracket there, as opposed to Penn State playing SMU, then possibly Boise State, who good teams this year, obviously in their own right, but not in the same vein as Tennessee and Ohio State. So I think maybe they'll have a conversation about the seeding. Um, and I think the biggest thing is everybody's saying like, hey, the conference bids and the buys themselves. So obviously 9 and 12 ranking overall, Boise State, Arizona State, they get buys, even though they're clearly not even in the top 5, right? Versus 16 Clemson, they're not even in the top 12 period, but they get that automatic bid. So I think they're going to keep the automatic bids. I don't see that going away because they want to make these conference championship games mean something. Like I mentioned earlier, if you play in your conference championship, you're basically going to be in your top 2 team in your conference. That's just kind of how that works for the most part. Outside of the championship with Boise State and Arizona State, everybody else got in. So I don't think that'll change. On the other hand, I do think they might reconsider the buys. And maybe it is just kind of unfair. And I think it's, the look of it. And Boise State had been a good team for a long time, constantly in the BCS bowls and everything. But I think the visual of seeing like Boise State there at 9, people are looking at it like, oh, why in the world does Boise State get a bye, right? Are they really the third best conference champion? Maybe not. Arizona State, they obviously played pretty well, but I do think they might consider that aspect of it, possibly reseeding, just based off of 1 through 12. And in that scenario, you wouldn't even have Clemson in there, and Arizona State, Boise State, they would not be getting buys either. So something to think about, but I do think the conference bids are probably going to stay. With that being said, Notre Dame, Indiana, that's going to be an interesting matchup. Indiana, obviously, their one loss against Ohio State. Kind of rough game. It got a little out of hand at the end there. Notre Dame, of course, their criticism is the Northern Illinois loss. They hadn't lost a game since that, but that is a blemish on their record, and since they're not in the conference, they're not beholden to these conference schedules. They should have joined the ACC. I don't know why that like fell apart. I mean, that they were supposed to, I think they announced it like 10 years ago that they were going to join them, and they only did it for like a year during COVID. So they can't even get the bye. So, I mean, that's kind of on them. But I think that'll be an interesting matchup. I'd probably take Notre Dame right now to move on to face Georgia. I would say Penn State over SMU, but I get your point. SMU did look pretty good in the second half. Later in the game, obviously being able to come back. I just don't know against like Clemson, and I put Penn State obviously over Clemson, but I mean against Clemson, you had that kind of performance. If Penn State plays the way they did against Oregon, you're not going to be able to mess around with that. Penn State probably will win that one. Move on against Boise State. I would take. I was going to say Ohio State, but then like thinking about it, I probably might take Tennessee right now. If Tennessee was playing some of his better ball near the end of the season, they had some rough moments, had some scares, but right now I'd probably say Tennessee actually. They're going to be in Ohio, of course, with the 8-9 matchup there, but who's to say? I mean, it's the one that's probably the biggest toss-up with that one. And then Clemson, Texas, I would take Texas, but I'll say this. I don't really know how good Texas is. We obviously joked for a long time about Texas being back. They of course, were back last year, early this season. And it's not their fault that, A&M already had 3 losses by the time they played them. Florida wasn't as good, of course. And, they thrashed them. Michigan, that loss. For Michigan, I mean, that was kind of embarrassing. They, of course, had that game against Ohio State at the end, but they didn't look nearly as good this year, losing a lot of their guys, losing their coach. So it's not their fault that some of these games that probably would have been more high profile didn't end up being high profile. But at the end of the day, they really didn't play the cream of the crop in the SEC. Let's be honest here. So I'm not really sure. They didn't play Tennessee, didn't play South Carolina, didn't play Bama, didn't play LSU, didn't play Missouri. I don't think they played Ole Miss either. So, I mean, you take the top half of the SEC, they played one of those teams and they played them twice and lost. So, I just don't know how good Texas is right now. I think I don't want to say favorable, but maybe that is more of a favorable matchup for Clemson. Riding high off of last week, being able to get in I think that might be a better matchup for them coming into this one. So definitely gonna be exciting, man. Again, I think this is probably the best way they could have done it. Moving to 12 teams. Initially, like I said, I thought 8 was going to be the mark, but I think moving to 12 probably the best way to do it, and probably the best we've had so far.
Yeah, and I'll just close out here. Obviously, we're not going to look to the future rounds because we don't want to do crazy hypotheticals, especially when we picked 3 out of the 4 games differently. But I think in regards to, I was also surprised that it was 12 and not 8. I think this works well. You get a system where you can get buys. You have a maybe less of a chance for arguments. Obviously, if Alabama misses and they're close to it, they're always going to be an argument, but that's whatever. I think, interestingly enough, maybe the more important game for the committee here is going to be the Clemson-Texas game, right? Like if Clemson comes in on an automatic bid and wins it against number 5 Texas, number 3 Texas, truthfully, but 5th seeded for the playoffs. I think that's big for the committee, for the ACC champion to come in and be the last seed because they were the ACC champion. But I also think, to agree with you that the automatic bid's going to stay, I think this is an outlier, right? Like I think, truthfully, Clemson probably shouldn't have been a 3-loss team. We shouldn't have lost to Louisville. Georgia, sure. South Carolina, sure. 2-loss team is not as bad. There's a lot of that going around this season. So I think this is an outlier. I don't think they're going to look at Clemson as like a typical, conference championship bid. Truthfully, I think most people thought SMU was going to win that championship anyway. So you wouldn't have this 3-loss team be the ACC champion. So yeah, I think as this moves on, we won't have this many weird conference champions. We might have some more battles going on. Who gets these last few seeds, but I don't think it's going to be a common thing for one of the conference champions to be one of the teams outside of the top 12. But I think it's going to be fun. I think this is a great way to do the bracket. I'm excited for the playoffs to start in a week or so, and it's going to be interesting to see where all this goes. It's going to be interesting to see Arizona State and Boise State as teams with buys, and I can say as a pure hater, not for the team, I'm happy that Boise State's game won't be at their home because I really hate their bright blue turf. But that's just me. So
Wow.
just a little tough to watch sometimes. It's kind of like the NBA in-season tournament courts. Some of those are really, I think, not great for the eyes when you got the TV on. But yeah, I think this is going to be fun. I'm excited to see where this goes. I think it's really cool that we picked very differently in this one too. So we'll have a very, very fun time when we get to the quarterfinals.